The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is often cited as the immediate cause of the First World War. This event in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, serves as the traditional starting point for the conflict that would engulf Europe. But this was not an isolated incident. The powder keg of Europe had been building towards a violent explosion for decades. A complex web of alliances, rivalries, imperial ambitions, and nationalistic tensions had been steadily escalating, making the continent increasingly volatile. So what really sparked the first shots of the Great War? Let's find out. Today, we will explore the complex web of events and factors that culminated in the outbreak of the First World War. Join us as we delve into the intricate details of this pivotal moment in history and uncover the true spark that ignited the Great War. The year is 1914, and Europe is a tinderbox, ready to ignite. For decades, simmering tensions have been building between the great powers, each vying for supremacy on the continent and beyond. At the heart of this powder keg is a young man named Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist with a deep-seated resentment towards Austro-Hungarian rule over Bosnia. On June, his world will change forever when he and his fellow members of the Black Hand Society plot to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who is scheduled to visit Sarajevo that day. But why Ferdinand? Why target this particular individual as the focus of their discontent? To understand the hatred directed at Ferdinand, it's crucial to grasp the larger political context of the time. Europe, in the early 20th century, was a hotbed of nationalism, a fervent sense of pride and loyalty towards one's nation. This burgeoning sentiment was particularly strong in the Balkans, a region that had long been under the control of various European empires, including the Ottoman, Austrian, and Russian empires. The people of the Balkans, known as the Balkan peoples, had grown tired of foreign domination and yearned for self-rule and independence. One such group were the Serbs, a Slavic people who lived within the vast and diverse Habsburg monarchy. The Serbs' desire for independence was not merely a demand for autonomy. It was also about forging a greater Serbia, a pan-Slavic state that would unite all Slavic peoples under one banner. This vision included territories held by other empires, particularly the Russians, who controlled Poland and parts of Romania, as well as the Ottomans, who still held on to territories in the Balkans. Enter Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Habsburg monarchy, whose empire encompassed a multitude of ethnicities, including many Slavs. His empire, often referred to as Austria-Hungary, was seen by many, including the Serbs, as a relic of the past, an outdated system of government that did not reflect the changing times and the rising tide of nationalism across Europe. The Archduke's presence in Sarajevo was a stark reminder of this foreign rule, a symbol of the obstacles standing in the way of the Serbs' dream of a free and independent state. On that fateful day in June, as Ferdinand's motorcade wound its way through the streets of Sarajevo, Princip and his accomplices watched intently. This was their chance to strike a blow for their nation, to eliminate the very embodiment of Habsburg rule and the perceived obstacle to their national aspirations. As Ferdinand's car approached, Princip took action, stepping out from the crowd and firing a series of shots. The Archduke and his wife were mortally wounded. Within hours, both would succumb to their injuries. This seemingly isolated act of violence sent shockwaves across Europe, plunging the continent into chaos and igniting the fuse of the First World War. In the aftermath of Ferdinand's assassination, Europe's leaders were faced with a critical decision. How should they respond to this audacious act on the heir to the Habsburg throne? The answer, however, was far from straightforward. For the Austrians, the assassination was a blatant challenge to their authority and a threat to the stability of their empire. They were determined to act decisively to protect their interests in Bosnia and to send a message to those who sought to undermine their rule. For the Russians, on the other hand, the situation was more complex. They had long-standing ties to Serbia, a nation with which they shared cultural and linguistic similarities and had been supportive of Serbian aspirations for independence. Yet they were also acutely aware of the potential consequences of getting involved in a conflict with Austro-Hungary, a powerful and potentially dangerous adversary. As the Russians deliberated, the French, who also had close ties to Serbia, began to voice their support for the Serbs, further complicating the diplomatic landscape. Amidst this web of alliances and obligations, the Russians found themselves torn between their commitments to Serbia and their concerns about provoking a wider conflict. The assassination had far-reaching implications, touching upon issues of national identity, imperial ambitions, and the balance of power in Europe. However, the Russians ultimately decided to side with the Antwerp, not because they wanted to start a war, but because they felt compelled by their obligations to their allies and their own imperial interests. The French, already entangled in colonial disputes with the British over North African territories, were eager for a conflict that might allow them to seize long-sought colonies. Their decision to side with the Entente was a calculated move to secure their position and advance their own interests. Meanwhile, the British, though bound by treaty to defend Belgium and not overly concerned about losing their empire, saw an opportunity to counter German influence. And so the stage was set for the outbreak of the First World War. A conflict that would drag in some of Europe's most powerful nations and reshape the continent forever. In the weeks following Ferdinand's assassination, Europe became a battleground of diplomacy as the great powers maneuvered to secure their interests and alliances. The Austrians, backed by the Germans, prepared for intervention in the Balkans, while the Russians, supported by the French and British, sought to protect Serbia. Each side sought to gain the upper hand, knowing that the balance of power in Europe was about to shift. Finally, on July 28, 1914, the Austrians declared war on Serbia, marking the official beginning of the conflict that would become known as the First World War. As the Austrians prepared to intervene in the Balkans, the other European powers watched closely, assessing the situation and making crucial decisions about their involvement. The Germans, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, had long been wary of Russian influence in the region, and saw Austria's actions as an opportunity to curb it. They pledged their unconditional support to Austria unconditionally, a decision that would commit them to the conflict and lead to the deployment of over 1 million German soldiers on the battlefield. As the French considered their options, their colonial disputes with the British over territories in Africa loomed large in their thinking. These disputes, which had been simmering for years, suddenly took on new urgency. The prospect of a wider European conflict offered an opportunity for the French to address their colonial grievances and potentially gain valuable territories. Meanwhile, the British, bound by treaty to defend Belgium, found themselves drawn into the conflict. Despite their initial reluctance, they too would commit significant resources to the war effort, deploying troops and establishing a naval blockade to counter German aggression. As these major powers made their decisions, smaller nations were also affected. The Dutch, caught between the British and German demands for access to their territory, were forced to comply, allowing Allied troops to enter Belgium. The Belgians, despite being neutral, found themselves on the front lines of the conflict, enduring some of the first major battles of the war and suffering heavy casualties before the Germans eventually overran their defences. These events highlight the far-reaching impact of the conflict, demonstrating how the actions of a few could so dramatically alter the course of history. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the catalyst that triggered a chain reaction of events leading to the outbreak of the First World War. As we have explored, the simmering tensions in Europe, particularly in the Balkans, created a volatile atmosphere in which even a single spark could ignite a conflagration. Ferdinand's death provided that spark, setting off a series of diplomatic crises, strategic decisions, and shifting alliances that plunged the continent into chaos. The complex web of nationalism, imperial rivalries, and treaty obligations entangled the great powers, drawing them into a conflict that would test their strength, resolve, and ultimately transform the world. While the immediate cause was the assassination, it was the underlying tensions and rivalries that provided the fuel for the fire, leading to one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The outbreak of the war also reveals the limitations of diplomacy and the complexities of international relations. Even as cooler heads might have prevailed, seeking peaceful resolutions to the crisis, the dynamics of power, ambition, and fear proved too potent to overcome. So, what lessons can we learn from this tumultuous period? Perhaps it is the realization that even a single event, seemingly isolated and contained, can have profound global repercussions. Or perhaps it is the sobering reminder of the dangers of unchecked nationalism or the perils of rigid alliance systems. Whatever the lesson, the outbreak of the First World War stands as a pivotal moment in history, shaping not only the 20th century, but the world we live in today. And with that, ends yet another journey through time. We hope you've enjoyed exploring the events and factors that led to the outbreak of the First World War. If you'd like to continue learning about this pivotal moment in history, we've got plenty more videos available. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.